This is Unit 3, Linear Relationships, Lesson 3, Representing Proportional Relationships, and Activity 3, Proportional Relationships. And this is called an info gap activity, where you're given a problem card and your partner is given a data card, and you have to come together, share that information. You're supposed to share it in a certain way, but I think you just come together, have a conversation, and complete those 4 different representations for a proportional relationship: a description, a table, a graph, and an equation. And I'm going to split this video up into 2 parts. This is card number 1, and I'm going to do card number 2 separately because these can be pretty long. All right, so here's card number 1, and here's data card number 1. So problem card 1, data card 1, and here's problem card number 2 and data card number 2. They both have to do with flour, and one has to do with flour and honey. That's problem card number 1. And the second one has to do with flour and salt. That's problem card number 2. In each case, you're asked to graph a certain amount of either honey or salt based on a given amount of flour. So in the first one, it's 17 cups of flour, and the second one is 23 cups of flour. All right, so problem card number 1. It says sketch a graph that shows the relationship between grams of honey and cups of flour needed for a recipe. Show on the graph how much honey is needed for 17 cups of flour. So what they're suggesting is that you use the graph to figure out how much honey you need. We're going to do it several different ways. We're going to use the equation and the graph, go back and forth a little bit. The amount that's given to you is 17 cups of flour. So usually what's given to you in the problem is the x value, the value that goes along the x-axis, and then you calculate the y value based on that amount that's given to you as the x value. So the input, how much is going into the problem. You have 17 cups of flour. That's the x value, that's cups of flour, and you're to calculate how many grams of honey you get out based on that number of cups of flour. So you have to put together a table. You have to start to get some idea of how to graph it, some idea of the relationship between these two. And as I just mentioned, flour is going to go on the x-axis, so we're going to make this column on the left. Usually that's the column for the x values, and the column on the right is the column for the y values. And so the x values are 6 cups of flour and 10 cups of flour, and the y values are 27 grams of honey and 45 grams of honey. So now, the slope, constant proportionality, they are related. And in this case, since this is a proportional relationship, for the equation for the y's and the x values, you don't, the number of units along in the y direction, the number of units in the x direction, you don't have to subtract or add anything, because that slope triangle, if we go back to thinking about slope triangles, is already against 0.00, the origin of the graph. So it's just y over x. That's why proportional relationships are easier to write equations for those relationships than others that we'll get into later. All right, so in the vertical direction, the number of units in the vertical direction compared to the number of units in the horizontal direction is called the slope. And so that's the number of grams compared to the cups, the number of grams of honey compared to the cups of flour. And so you just pick these out and pick out an easy one to work with, and that's 45 to 10, because that's just 45 divided by 10. So that equals 4.5. So for every cup of flour, that's what this 1 means here, for every cup of flour, you need 4.5 grams of honey. So if you multiply that number of cups of flour by 10, then you're going to need 10 times this number of grams of honey for the appropriate number of grams for 10 cups of flour, which is 45 grams of honey. So that's the constant of proportionality. And this is also called the unit rate. For 1 cup of flour, 1 unit, 1 cup, how many grams of honey do you need? Well, you need 4.5 grams of honey. We're going to look at this on the graph in a little while. And so the second row on the table should also fit this constant proportionality if it's a proportional relationship. That's one way to check. If they all equal the same or all have the same constant proportionality, then it truly is a constant of proportionality. So 27 grams of honey to 6 cups of flour is still 4.5 grams of honey for 1 cup of flour. And you can see that 4 times 6 is 24, and then another half of 6, which is 3. 24 plus 3 gets you to that 27 right there. All right, so what they're saying is that the number of grams of honey is 4.5 times the number of cups of flour. So the number of units in cups of flour, you multiply that number by 4.5, that's going to tell you how many units of honey in grams that you need. So that if you just say that, then you can write the equation. So the number of grams of honey is equal to 4.5 times the number of cups of flour. This goes back to writing the equation. If you remember, this is the letter K, y equals kx, which is the constant of proportionality, which is the unit rate, which is the slope. All of that stuff gets wrapped into one number. All right, so once again, the number of units in the vertical direction, if you're going to draw that slope triangle, is 4.5 times the number of units that you would draw in the horizontal direction. So y is equal to 4.5 times x. So you can actually draw this arc around here like this, or an arrow like that, and say y is equal to 4.5 times x. And we'll learn the algebra a little bit later, how you algebraically move that x over to this side, and you turn it into this form. Y is equal to 4.5 times x. All right, so if they're giving you 17 cups of flour, so first of all, we're going to use the equation to figure out how many grams of honey that you need. And then we're going to graph that and check that on the graph. You could graph it first, draw the line, and I'll show you how to do that as well. All right, so if we plug in 17 cups of flour, so for every cup of flour, you get 4.5 grams of honey. That means 4.5 times the 17 cups of flour is going to tell you how many grams of honey you need, and that's 76.5 grams of honey. So now, when we go to graph this, you have to look at these values. These are the largest values. 17 cups is the largest value for flour, and 76.5 grams is the largest amount for honey. And so that's the how far out you have to make your scales when you draw the graph. So along the x-axis, the farthest you have to go out is that 17 cups of flour. Well, this graph only goes up to 14 if you count by ones. Now you could count by twos, and this would get you out to 20 right here. This would be 18. This would be 16. So 17 would be right here. And that would be okay, and that probably may have been a better choice, but I just chose to increase this 3 more spaces. Now you have to make sure these are the correct distance, the correct width, but you can add 3 more lines and go out to 17. And along the y-axis, you have to get out to 76.5. Well, it's probably easiest just to count by tens. Counting by tens gets you up to 100. If you count by fives, this is going to be 50, 55, 60, 65, 70. That doesn't quite get you out enough. You can count by sixes, sevens, eights, but you want to use easy numbers. So you want to count by twos, ones, tens, hundreds. In this case, we're going to count by tens. So 76.5 is going to be about right here as we do this. All right, so let's graph a couple of the values that we know. So 6 cups of flour. So you would draw an arrow up from the 6, and actually I'm showing this the end result, but I would draw an arrow over from 27. You just have to make a guess where that 27 is between 20 and 30. And so then you draw an arrow this way, and where those 2 arrows intersect is that point right there. That is the point. That is the connection for this recipe between how many cups of flour you need and the number of grams of honey you need for this recipe. This line, as a matter of fact, is the connection for any amount of cups of flour to any number of grams of honey for that recipe. If the line was different, it would be for a different recipe. It would be a different relationship between cups of flour and grams of honey. All right, so if you go to 10, go out to 10 cups of flour, and again, I would go to halfway. This makes your life a little bit easier because it's halfway in between 40 and 50, and I draw the arrow this way, and where they intersect, I place the point. And you also know it goes through 0, 0. And then you can connect these 2 points. I would connect the 45, 10, or the 10, 45, go out 10 units and then up 45 units with the 0, 0, because you're pretty sure that's placed in the right spot. And then you can adjust this spot, this point, if it's not quite on the line. Okay, draw that line, and you would extend it way past here, and then you go down to the 17, and you draw an arrow up to that line at 17, and that's the point. And what's the y value for that point? How many grams of honey is it? It's 76.5, and you'd have to guess what that is. This wouldn't be marked for you. You'd have to guess it, so you can get the exact value from the equation. All right, so now we have the equation. So grams of honey is equal to 4.5 times the number of cups of flour. So what's going into the recipe is, gee, I have 17 cups of flour. How many grams of honey do I need to add? Well, for every 4.5 cups, I need to add a gram of honey. I have 17 cups, so that's 4.5 times 17. Gives you the number of grams of honey. So you have the equation, you have the graph. We put the table together a little while ago. So there's the table, equation, graph, and you could turn these words up here into descriptions. So those would be the 4 different representations: the description, a table, a graph, and an equation. 4 representations. And this is the unit rate. So for 1 cup of flour, how many grams of honey do you need? So you go up to the line, and then you draw that line over to here. And again, you just have to guess. This wouldn't be marked for you. The tick marks in the scale aren't going to be small enough to be able to tell you exactly where this point is. Again, you can get it from the equation, which we did. So we know that grams of honey is 4.5 grams of honey. So this is the unit rate. 1 cup of flour along the x-axis, you need 4.5 grams of honey. And this is number 2. We'll come back to that in the next video.